this Ukrainian counteroffensive. We all saw this column of destroyed tanks, the Bradleys, the Leopards. The counteroffensive, has it stopped? Has it failed? There's talk of it being frozen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's failed and it's going to fail. It has no chance of succeeding. Understand, when we speak of the counteroffensive, what we're talking about is the assault breaching of a fortified position. That's a military term of art. It's one of the most difficult missions that can be assigned to a military unit, especially if the defensive positions are well prepared and supported by firepower, artillery, air power, etc. The Russian defenses in this area, are the most well-prepared defenses in modern history. They've been designed by a specialist in Russian defensive doctrine. He wrote the defensive doctrine. The defenses are based upon his instruction, and he has been put in command. So all the strengths accrue to Russia. In order for the Ukrainian offensive to be considered a success, it would have to breach the Russian defenses. And by breaching, that means you have to penetrate all three layers and clear the Russians out of the other side of the final defensive line. Only then can you have considered to have breached it. Anything short of that, you're trapped in the Russian defensive system and you're going to die. And so the Ukrainians haven't even cleared the initial contact zone of the first line of defense. They haven't penetrated the first line of defense. It's doubtful whether they've even made contact with the first line of defense. They're being stopped well short by the barriers that the Russians have put in place and by the flexible defense tactics that the Russians are employing to absorb the Ukrainian attack. And so here we are, 2 weeks into this counteroffensive. They haven't even reached the first line of defense.
Oh, boy.
And they've been tasked with breaching the Russian defensive systems. I will tell you right now that they don't stand a chance of succeeding. I doubt they'll ever reach the first line of defense. I doubt they'd ever penetrate the first line of defense. And I will put every dollar I'll ever make in my entire life on the fact that they will never breach the totality of the Russian defenses. This is going to end up as a strategic defeat, not only for Ukraine, but for its NATO sponsors. Remember, these brigades that Ukraine is using for this fight have been created for this very purpose. Right. They have been equipped by NATO. They have been trained by NATO. They are attacking where NATO has told them to attack. This attack has been war gamed out on a NATO computer simulation known as Cora. And every aspect of this fight has been played out, simulated. And I have to tell you, somebody who has an experience in doing this kind of simulation in preparation of the Marine Corps' breach of Iraqi defensive lines back in 1991, which was successful, by the way, I can tell you that you can't accurately and with integrity simulate the reality of this battlefield and come up with a solution that says Ukraine can win. And what I'm trying to say is that NATO has deceived the Ukrainians. NATO has done a war game that gave the Ukrainians a false sense of hope. NATO has willingly sent these Ukrainian soldiers to their death on the field of battle against the Russians.
So, Scott, I went into this, and perhaps you could elaborate. I talked about because you mentioned these multiple layers of defense, and I was talking about Dragon's Teeth, the anti-tank ditches, or traps, pits, whatever, and then the zigzagged manned trenches for infantry positions. So, I mean, are you saying basically that the Ukrainians are failing because of it's not a lack of equipment, a lack of training, it's insurmountable?
It's a combination of both. To be honest, I would never send, again, the units that should be used to carry out the assault breaching of a fortified defensive line should be highly trained units who are intimately familiar with the equipment that they're going to be using and the tactics that they're going to be employing.
And that's not the case, because these are new systems.
Yeah, giving the Ukrainians this NATO equipment at the last minute. Remember, they fell in on their equipment, their Bradleys and their Leopards, in January and February of this year, and then they were given rudimentary training at Grafenwohr and other NATO bases from the middle of January up until May. And then they were told to take this equipment and carry out the single most complicated assault mission imaginable. The Ukrainians don't know how to use their equipment. They're not familiar with it, especially in a combat tactical sense, where you need to be intimately familiar with every aspect of this equipment to make it do that which you not only want it to do, but which you're anticipating the necessity of doing. You can't anticipate something if you don't understand the equipment you're in.
Yeah.
You don't know the level, don't know how to operate it, don't know how it works. It's not seamless. There's no sixth sense taking place. They're simply driving a death trap to their imminent demise. The same thing with the Bradley. And even if they knew this equipment, they don't understand the tactics. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. And one of the reasons is because NATO has deceived them, because no commander in their right mind would allow themselves to initiate an assault breaching operation without considering all of the aspects of suppression. Suppression, there's a U.S. Army mnemonic that they use for assault breaching, and the first letter is an S, and it stands for suppression, and suppression is the key. Without suppression, nothing else happens, because you have to suppress the enemy's artillery. You have to suppress the enemy's anti-tank missiles. You have to suppress their air power. You have to screen yourself so that you can begin the very dangerous task of working your way through these obstacle belts that you spoke of, the minefields, the dragon's teeth, the initial trench works, the screening forces, to get to that first line of defense. And then you have to puncture that, clear the rear, and then move on. And you have to do that 3 times. And the whole time you have to do that, you have to suppress the enemy. There is no suppression taking place. It's not just the firepower. Electronic warfare is an important aspect of this, jamming the Russians' ability to communicate. Because if I'm a Russian in my trench line and here come the Ukrainians, and I'm trying to make contact with artillery to call in a fire mission, I shouldn't be allowed to do this. They should be jamming this signal. There should be no communication. I shouldn't be able to contact air power. But the Russians right now have seamless command and control. They're coordinating their fire support. The Ukrainians are walking into pre-designated kill zones where the artillery is just pounding down on them. The aircraft are coming in without any intervention. There's no air defense worthy of the name. And the Ukrainians are getting slaughtered, not just on the line of contact, but in the rear assembly areas. This was known. Anybody who knows anything, and I have to imagine that the NATO instructors are familiar with assault breaching operations. They wrote the darn book, that they should never have allowed this attack to take place, because it's literally suicide. The only way you could justify this attack is if you artificially skewed the computer simulation so that the opponent ran away. I call it the Monty Python defense, search for the Holy Grail. Right. The white rabbit shows up and they run away. And basically the Ukrainians become the white rabbit and the Russians become the knights of the round table, and they run away. That's the only way this simulation works, is if you give the Russians all of the negative attributes that I guess Ukrainian propaganda and Western propaganda has been putting on them. But what we found out is that everything that the West has been saying negative about the Russian troops is proven to be false. First of all, they built very impressive defensive positions. I remember when the Russians were first digging it, all of the all of the bros and the fellas and anybody else you want to say online were mocking it. Look at that. Those dragon teeth are going to stop nothing. What are they digging lines behind for? What's the purpose of all this? It's called doctrine, guys. Doctrine. And the Russians executed it perfectly. And then they said, well, these mobilized forces, they can't fight. They have no morale, no training. They weren't trained.
They always said this thing about morale. There's no morale.
Low morale. And then Russian generals and colonels and majors, they're all drunk. They don't know what they're doing. There's no command and control. The Russians don't do anything. They blah, 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 blah. Turns out the Russians are perhaps the most professional force in Europe right now. Those mobilized guys, they're not only trained well, pretty damn brave, standing their ground. The Ukrainians are saying, we expect you to run away, and you guys are fighting for every square inch. Mm-hmm. And the Russians are smart about this. They let the Ukrainians come in, and they fix them. And then when the Ukrainians commit to where the Russians want them to commit, because the Russians will hold strong in one area, loosen in another, the Ukrainians will migrate to the loose. The Russians will pull back because they're not in the business of needlessly dying. Are the Russians suffering casualties? Putin has said so. 1 to 10, he said. 1 to 10. And that's a president who knows what he's talking about. That means for every 10 Ukrainian casualties, there's 1 Russian casualty. Now, right now, we're probably looking at around 10,000 Ukrainian dead.
Okay.
That means that the Russians have probably lost about 1,000 dead. That's only a lot of guys.
I mean, I know it's obviously a lot of people, but the ratio is incredible. I mean, how is that? How is that possible?
Because the Ukrainians aren't suppressing. Because the Ukrainians are literally
they have no air force, right?
Of their force.
They have no air force. The
totality of their force is exposed to everything the Russians have. The Russians are able to come in with their air force, their fixed wing, their helicopters. They're able to employ their artillery. They're able to bring in their anti-tank screening forces and kill everything that moves. That's what's happening.
I mean, the thing I wanted to ask you, Scott, is that the Russians are defending a very, very long line, right? So I mean, you could argue that in one sense, I mean, perhaps another army would have they would have collapsed at one point, because it's a very long line if we consider all the defenses that they've built. The other thing I wanted to mention, the mud. This is mud season, and I thought Ukrainians would know their own weather, right? So you got vehicles getting bogged down and trapped.
Well, the weather is bad. It's clearing up now. We're in June, so the Rasputitsa, the muddy season, is either over or just about to be over. But you're right. The ground is still going to be soggy, especially when employing 62-ton Leopard tanks, which are not designed for unimproved roads. The small bridges that operate in this area of the world, the fields, it makes it difficult for the Leopards to maneuver. But the other thing is, it is a long line of defense. But understand that the Russians learned their lesson from last September, where they sought to hold a long line of contact with insufficient troops, and they had strong points with big gaps between them, not enough artillery to cover the gaps, and the Ukrainians were able to shoot the gaps and get into the Russian rear and cause a collapse of the Russian defenses. That's a strategy the Ukrainians appear to be trying to replicate right now, but the Russians have learned their lessons. We're not dealing with 180,000 Russian troops like we had back in September, October. We're dealing with around, I would say, between 500 and 700,000 Russian troops. Many of them aren't in the line of contact. They're being held in reserve, ready to counterattack, which is, the final part of the Russian defense doctrine, which is to absorb the attack of the attacking party, let them spend their combat power, and then at the moment of their greatest weakness, to launch a concerted counterattack to push them back and seize the offensive. So the Russians have about 220,000 troops that have yet to be committed into this fight, who are well-trained, equipped with the best equipment possible, and they're standing by, get the Red Star Cluster, or Green Star Cluster, or whatever the Russian signal is to advance. But meanwhile, the Russians have 450, 500,000 troops that they've put into these defensive positions that are not all in the front line. They're defending in depth, doctrine. And they have more than enough manpower to to defend the totality of their space. The Ukrainians will not find any gaps, any weak spots.